Can you go to prison for writing a letter? Not a threat, not some kind of confession, but a simple one-page letter stating a legal opinion. Okay, stick with me here, because we're about to dive into the bizarre and tangled case of a public prosecutor whose entire career was destroyed by a single piece of paper.
All right, let's start at the end, shall we? Because that's where things get really interesting. In December 2004, a court delivered its verdict, sentencing a public official to 3 years in prison. But this wasn't your typical corruption case, not by a long shot. So what on earth could be written in a single-page office letter that warrants a prison sentence for a prosecutor? Well, the answer is way more complex and honestly more ironic than you can probably imagine. To really get what happens, we need to meet the man at the center of this whole storm and understand the very specific crime he was accused of committing. This is our guy, Prosecutor Romero Barrio. His job? To uphold the law. But in this crazy twist of fate, the legal system he was a part of, well, it turned right around and pointed the fingers squarely at him, accusing him of betraying his duties. Now, the charge against him has this very specific name, prevaricato, which is basically malfeasance. And look, this isn't about making a simple mistake or an oopsie. No, this is a serious crime. It's when a public official knowingly, intentionally makes a decision they know is flat out illegal. And in this case, the prosecution argued that his illegal decision was all contained in that one letter. But before we can even get to the letter itself, you have to understand the absolute mess of a financial dispute that landed on his desk in the first place. And it all kicked off because of delayed paychecks. So on one side, you've got these workers from the local hospital. They weren't getting paid on time, and they were desperate for cash. On the other side, a local moneylender named Soledad Bula, who saw a business opportunity. She would buy the rights to their future paychecks, giving them cash right away, but, at a discount. Now, this whole practice actually has a legal name. It's called cesión de crédito, or credit assignment. And believe it or not, it's a totally legal thing to do. You're just selling a debt that someone owes you to a third party. So the hospital workers were literally selling the debt the hospital owed them to the moneylender. You can probably see where this is going, right? It created a huge mess. The hospital is sitting there like, who do we pay? The workers who actually did the job, or the moneylender who now legally owns the right to collect? And to make it even worse, some workers filed criminal complaints against the moneylender, accusing her of usury, basically loan sharking with illegally high interest rates. This is the tangled web that landed on Prosecutor Romero Barrio's desk. And that brings us to the letter. The single most important piece of evidence in the entire case against the prosecutor. Let's actually take a look at the document that started it all. There it is, dated February 18th, 2003, and addressed to the hospital's paymaster. This document, which is really just a few paragraphs long, would end up being picked apart by lawyers and judges for years. And yes, it's what ultimately led to a conviction. And right there in the letter, we find the single phrase that prosecutors would just seize on. Romero Barrio wrote that, in his view, the matter, its legal nature, is more civil than penal. That's it. It was his professional opinion. But the state was about to argue that putting that opinion on paper was a criminal act. So let's break that down. The crucial part is this. By stating the dispute was a private, civil matter, Romero Barrio was essentially telling the hospital's paymaster that his prosecutor's office wouldn't block payments to the moneylender. He was clearing the way for Soledad Bula to collect on the paychecks she had bought. So let's head to the courtroom and see how this all plays out. The prosecution argued this wasn't just an opinion, it was an illegal order. And this all centered on a really key legal distinction. Was this a crime of action or omission? Think of it this way. A crime of action is when you do something illegal, like actively issuing an order that goes against the law. A crime of omission is when you fail to do something you're legally required to do. The prosecutor was initially charged with the first one. The prosecution's case was pretty clear. That letter was effectively an illegal order that favored the moneylender.
They argued it overrode a previous decision by another office to hold the checks and that Romero Burrio had abused his power by intervening in a way that was completely contrary to the law.
But the defense, they painted a very different picture. They argued Romero Barrio was just trying to mediate a chaotic situation. The letter, they said, wasn't a binding judicial order at all. It was just an informal communication expressing his good faith belief that this was a contract dispute for civil courts, not a criminal matter from his office. His goal was to find a solution, not to break the law.
So you have two completely different interpretations of the exact same letter? What did the courts decide? Well, the legal battle that followed was long and, frankly, it got complicated. Initially, back in 2004, the lower court agreed with the prosecution. Romero Barrio was convicted of malfeasance by action and sentenced to 3 years. But he appealed, right? He took it all the way to the Supreme Court. The High Court upheld the conviction, but with a huge change. They decided his crime wasn't one of action, but of omission, that he failed to act properly. They reduced his sentence, but the conviction stood. He was a convicted criminal. You'd think the story would end right there. A prosecutor found guilty of malfeasance for a letter he wrote. But nope. There's one final, absolutely stunning twist to this case.
Remember her? The whole case revolved around whether her business was a criminal enterprise. Well, while the prosecutor was fighting for his freedom, the case against her for usury was slowly making its way through a different court entirely.
And in 2011, years after the prosecutor's conviction, that court reached a verdict. Soledad Buya was acquitted. The court found she had not committed the crime of usury. And this is where the final, devastating irony comes in. The reason for her acquittal? The court officially ruled that these disputes over credit assignments were not criminal. They should be pursued, and I'm quoting here, in the civil sphere and not in the penal. This was the exact legal opinion that Prosecutor Romero Barrio wrote in his letter, the very opinion that sent him to prison. And that's what this whole case boils down to. One man was convicted for stating a legal opinion that another court later declared to be correct. It just leaves us with this difficult question. What does justice mean when the system can convict you for being right just at the wrong time?